All right, so chapter 1 is very quick, and it's meant to be just a basic introduction to the topics that we're going to cover in the class. Just very basic real estate topics. And you know, for some of you, just FYI on the slides, I noticed some of you are already doing it. It does help sometimes to just take the packet out of your binder and just deal with the one if you want to, because I know that binder's a little bit unwieldy. Just kind of take it out and deal with that one packet, and you can stick them back in there. It's whatever you're more comfortable with. But that binder is going to be really helpful in keeping you organized, because you're going to have a lot of papers by the end of this class. We've burned through a lot of paper around here. All right, chapter 1, basic concepts. So, why is my clicker not working? There we go. First thing we need to talk about is vocabulary related. You're going to see these suffixes. A suffix is just something we stick on the end of a word that changes its meaning. You're going to see these two suffixes, OR and EE, a lot throughout this class. So I want to make sure that we have an understanding of what they mean before we even get going. OR, when you see it at the end of a word, means giver. That's the person doing the giving of whatever we're talking about. So let's just focus on like the word offer. The word offer. The offeror is the person who is making the offer, the person who is giving the offer. So in a traditional buyer-seller scenario, who do you think would be making the offer? Would that be the buyer making the offer or the seller making the offer? Buyer makes the offer, so the buyer is going to be called the what? Offeror. The buyer would be the offeror, which would make the seller the offeree. Whenever you see EE on the end of a word, that means the person receiving the thing that you're talking about. So the offeror is the person making the offer. The offeree is the person who is receiving the offer. Does that make sense for everybody? When we talk about deeds, we're going to use the word grant. So we have a grantor and we have a grantee. The grantor is the person who is making the grant or giving the grant. The person receiving it is the what? The grantee. A grantor is a person who's transferring ownership. You're going to hear me use that word a lot. Grantor. So in a buyer-seller situation, who is the grantor? Who would be transferring ownership to the other person? Is it the buyer who's transferring ownership to the seller, or is it the seller who's transferring ownership to the buyer? Seller transferring ownership to the buyer. So who would be the grantor? Seller. The seller would be, and then who would be the grantee? The buyer. Does that make sense? The grant is the transfer of ownership. So a grantor would be whoever has ownership to transfer, so the seller. And the grantee would be the person receiving ownership, which would be the what?
Buyer.
The buyer. The buyer. You need to start to connect those words, because you're going to hear me use them over and over and over. And I have to use them over. I'm not using them over and over to be confusing. I'm using them over and over to make you comfortable with them. You need to get comfortable with a word like grantor. So what do I mean when I say the word grantor? And I do this a lot, by the way. I just ask questions. I want it, it's how I keep you engaged. So what do I mean when I say the word grantor later today? That's a person doing what? Transferring what? Ownership to somebody else. So the word grantor just means any person who owns property and is transferring that ownership over to somebody else. Traditionally, that would be a seller. Could it also be somebody who's giving a gift? If somebody has gifting property, would they also be called a grantor? Yeah, because they're taking their ownership and doing what with it? Transferring it or granting it to own. So, Kevin, I grant you ownership. I am the grant what? Am I the grantor or the grantee? Grantor, and Kevin would be the grantee. Does that make sense for everybody? So we're going to see the O-R-E-E suffix a lot. So I want to just get it out of the way. And it doesn't make a difference what word you attach it to. Like, for example, lease. We have lessees and lessors. The lessor is going to be the person giving the lease. Well, what is a lease? What two parties agree to a lease? Landlord and tenant. So who do you think is the lessor? Who's giving the lease? The landlord. So just right there you learned how to use the word lessor correctly. So who is receiving the lease? The tenant. So what's the legal terminology for a tenant? A lessee or leasee. You can say leasee. It's pronounced lessee, but leasee works just fine. You know what we're talking about. You see how just knowing the vocabulary helps you instantly be able to learn the topic. Are you with me on that? So it's really important that you got these suffixes down because we're going to see them over and over and over. All right? Clicker not working again. Okay. This chapter, again, just an overview. Very basic. Not a lot in here that's going to show up on the test. Just kind of meant to get you in the mode of things. All right, I'm going to go crazy with my computer today because my remote's not working here. Okay, working now. All right, we care about real property. You're going to see the words real property and personal property a lot in this class. Real property is real estate. Personal property is everything else. This is a real estate class, so we care about real property. When we talk about selling something in this class, we're talking about selling the real property, not about selling what? The personal property. Give me some examples of things you think are personal property. I'm sorry?
Furniture.
Your car. That's a perfect example. So if we sell the house, are we selling the cars that are in the driveway with it? No. No, we're not. So that differentiation between real property and personal property is a big deal. Here is a definition of real property. It says real property includes land and everything that's permanently attached to the land. And then we give you this word appurtenant. This is a word, this is your big word for the day. The word pertinent. It's a fancy word. And we're going to see it over and over and over in this class. An appurtenance is anything that is permanently attached to the land. Now, you need to understand things can be permanently attached either physically, you can see them. Is this building permanently attached to the land? Yes. Why are you shaking your head at me? Well, how would it not be? Talk to me. Seriously, I'm not putting you on the spot. I want to know where your brain is.
Well, I mean, it can get bulldozed.
Ah, that's what I thought you were. That's why I wanted to point it out. She said it could be bulldozed. So let's talk about what the word permanently attached means, all right? By, hold on, I think Cameron, is that right? By Cameron's definition, that's pretty good because I can't see it from here, so, you know. By Cameron's definition, nothing would ever be permanently attached because she said you could drop a thermonuclear bomb on it and it would go away, right? That's not our definition of permanent attachment though. So we need to eliminate that kind of a thought process. Here's my definition of permanently attached, and it's not in your slides, so you might want to write it down. Is it nailed, screwed, glued, or buried in the ground? That's a permanent attachment. Anything that is nailed, screwed, glued, or buried in the ground. So by that definition, is this building a permanent attachment to this property? Yes. Absolutely. So would a tree be a permanent attachment to this property? Yes. And what I'm telling you is those are appurtenances. Appurtenances are things that are permanently attached, but there are also lots of appurtenances to this property that you can't see. Like, for example, the city has placed restrictions on this property called zoning. Zoning limits what you can do with the property. Those restrictions are appurtenant, which means the restrictions are what? Attached. And what that means is they never get unattached. See, this word appurtenant, things that are appurtenant are forever. And that's really important when we talk about real property, because appurtenances are going to be things that transfer with the real property. In other words, if I sell this piece of land, I'm not only selling the land, but what else am I selling with it?
Everything attached to it.
Everything permanently attached. So therefore the building, the trees, the sidewalks, all those appurtenances. And not just those physical appurtenances, but the ones we can't see. Does the zoning go with the property? Do any limitations that are attached to the property go with it? So that next owner, they don't want the limitations. Too bad for them. Guess what? Part of the deal. That's what the word appurtenance means, and we're going to revisit it over and over and over. Personal property is anything that's not real property. The biggest characteristic, I don't want you to lose sight of the forest for the trees. The biggest characteristic of personal property is this. It can move. Now, that's not going to always be the case, but if you're trying to decide if something is personal property or real property, what's the first question you should ask yourself? Is it movable? Is it permanently attached? Because if it was permanently attached, if it was nailed, screwed, glued, or buried in the ground, could I do that with it? No. So what do you think this chair is? Is it real property or is it personal property? It's personal property. It's personal property. The biggest characteristic of personal property is always going to be that it is movable. That's not the only characteristic, but it is the biggest one. Yes, sir, Brandon?
If you had, like, if you're selling something as is and a car's on the property, does that become part of the real property?
You can tell Brandon's from Eastern North Carolina because we were already talking about cars being on blocks in the driveway on the first day of class. Brandon's question, well, I love this question. Brandon's question was, if I'm selling the property and there's a car on the property that's abandoned, I assume, does it become part of the property? And the answer is no, because it's not permanently attached to the property. Now, generally speaking, it's expected that a seller would remove any personal property prior to closing. What I will tell you about something like that, though, is ultimately the responsibility for that falls back on whoever's buying the property. Because once you bought it, it's yours. So the real answer there is, if the buyer wants that moved, the best course of action for them is not to do what? Not to close. Don't give them your money until you're satisfied with the condition of the property, because once you've paid for it, it belongs to you. Does that make sense? So if the buyer had an objection to that car being there on the day of closing, they should just say, no, we're not closing until you get rid of that. That help? Okay, good. Good. All right. We also use different words to refer to personal property. Like they'll say things like chattel sometimes, or personalty, personal property. All of that means the same thing. Those are just all vocabulary words that mean the same thing. Yes, ma'am, Malika.
So there, sometimes you see houses that are above, they pick it up. Now, if it's not attached anymore, is it now considered?
Is it levitating?
Yes.
Oh, it's levitating. Really? I want to see this house. We need to go on a tour today.
It's on a flatbed or, some big, you see them sometimes.
So you're talking about when they are physically relocating the house. They have physically picked it up, put it on the back of a truck.
Yeah, like you see it with like historic houses.
So for the time being that it's on the back of the truck, what kind of property is it?
Personal.
It's personal property. And then once they get it to its destination and they reattach it to a new piece of property, it becomes what again? Real property. It becomes real. Okay? So yeah, I thought you meant like houses on stilts. I was making fun of you, but you really were talking about moving something. So when it's on the back of that truck, personal. Absolutely. Okay? Land. Here's a definition of land. It says land is the earth's surface and everything above it and everything below it. Not just the actual surface, but everything below and everything above is land. So what that means, folks, is when you purchase real estate or real property or land, not only are you purchasing what you can see, but you're also purchasing what? Things that are below and things that are above. So if we discover that there is some type of natural resource below the ground, oil, gas, water, minerals, gold, diamonds, whatever it happens to be, who do those things belong to? They belong to whomever owns what? What was that, Devin? The land above it. Does that make sense for everybody? Because when you purchase land, at least in this country, the definition we use of land is that it's everything both above and below the surface of the earth is included in that. And that's different, folks, in other countries. That's a definition that's somewhat unique to the United States. There are other countries where even if you own the real property, you don't necessarily own what's below it or above it. Those might be national sort of resources. That's not the way it works here. We own everything above and below. Is everybody with me on that? Okay? So I believe in Venezuela that is true, right? Would below subsurface resources belong to the state? Is that true in Venezuela? Yeah. So, and so that's a different definition that we utilize in the United States. Okay? Real estate is land and everything that's attached to the land. So real estate is just a bigger definition of land. So when we talk about the real estate, we're now including things like the structures that are on the land. Okay? And real property ultimately means the same thing as real estate. So we're going to use those terms interchangeably for the rest of the class. They're going to mean exactly the same thing. Whether you see real estate, real property, land, we use them all interchangeably. They all mean the exact same thing. It's the surface of the earth, everything above it, everything below it, and everything that's attached to it. That's the definition we use for real estate. Right? Land has some physical characteristics. It can't be moved. It's immovable. It can't be destroyed. It's indestructible. And it is unique. This one is the important one. So I want you to highlight or circle uniqueness as a characteristic of land. It's probably the most important characteristic of land. That it is unique. That every piece of land is completely unique from every other piece of land. That's an important legal idea. And here's why. If you get in a dispute is an argument. Where do most disputes end up in this country? In a court of law. Somebody sues somebody. Well, if you end up in a dispute over a real estate transaction, like say for example, a seller is trying to back out of a deal. A seller has decided they don't want to sell even though they had agreed to sell. The buyer can take that seller to court and force them to sell them that property. The buyer's not asking for money or for damages. They're asking the court to force them to sell that property. And the reason they can ask the court to do that is because they can't get that piece of property from anywhere else. It is completely what? Unique. There is no replacement for it. If I agreed to buy this property, there's nothing else you can substitute for it because every single property is completely unique. And we view land that way even in the most cookie-cutter subdivision you can imagine. Even if every lot looks the same to you in the eyes of the law, there is no substituting one piece of land for another. Is everybody okay with that idea? That's the most important of these characteristics. Now we also have some economic characteristics of land. It is scarce. That's an economic characteristic because the more scarce or the less of it there is available, what do you think that does to the value of it? It goes up. Location. Location sounds like it would be a physical characteristic, but it's actually an economic characteristic. And here's why. We always say the three most important words in real estate are what? Location, location, location. And why are they the three most important words in real estate? They affect what most directly? The value of the property. The better the location is, the more preferred the location is, the more value the property has. So that's an economic type characteristic. This word improvements, there's a word you ought to write a definition for. We're going to see that word a lot. This building is an improvement. The sidewalk out there, the parking lot, those are improvements. What do they all have in common? How did they get here? They were added by whom? Either the owner or some other person. An improvement is something that is placed on a piece of real property by humans that's designed to do what to the value? To increase or add value. So anything that's added to a property that's designed to add value to the property by humans is considered an improvement. So the example, this building is an improvement you can see. Are there going to be improvements you can't see?
Yes.
Yeah. How about like things like water and sewer? I can't see those, but are they improvements? Sure they are. They add value to the property. They add usefulness to the property. So improvements are any kinds of changes that people make. to real property desired to add value to it. Again, as I said, do not get freaked out when you see different words for real property, realty, real estate. They all mean the same thing. These are not different terminologies. They all mean the same thing. This idea of highest and best use is something that's going to come up a lot during the class. And again, I know it seems like we're flying through a lot of topics. Trust me, we will get to a point where we slow down and we spend minutes and minutes and minutes on one slide. This chapter is just meant to be a quick overview of things. Highest and best use. The idea of highest and best use is every property has one special use. One thing that if the owner used it for that purpose would get the best return on their investment. Most properties are already being used for their highest and best use. We all recognize when something's not being used for its highest and best use. So let me give you an example of what I mean by that. If you were to see in the middle of Cary a little tiny brick house built in about 1950 that's sitting on 2 acres of land on the corner of a busy intersection, and it's surrounded by shopping centers and restaurants and all those things, and it's right on the corner of a busy intersection, would you look at that and go, man, those people are doing the best thing possible with that 2 acres of land, keeping that little 1,500 square foot brick ranch house on it? Would you say that?
No.
Or would you? Yes, sir, Brandon.
Isn't that kind of a two-sided question?
How so?
Because they could keep the property as it is and the value would go up because it isn't being used. But it could also be, used for a higher purpose.
Well, and that's why, so I get where you're coming from. That's why in this case there is a highest and best use, because the highest and best use is the thing that they could do at that one moment in time. They could, of course, delay development, and that might bring a higher value down the road. The highest and best use is right now. So when we're asking the question, we're saying, what would bring the greatest return on my investment right at this second? Does that make sense? And so if that were the case on that property, what would the highest and best use of that property probably be? Assuming they're in an area zoned for commercial, which they obviously are, because they're surrounded by other commercial development. They got 2 acres here on the corner of a busy intersection. What's the highest and best use of that property? Some type of business, probably a Sheetz, right? A gas station of some kind, if it's on the corner of a busy intersection. So when and my point in saying that is, when you're trying to come up with a value for that house, you're not going to say, oh, well, a 1,500 square foot ranch is worth this. You're going to say, well, who cares what it is? We're going to value it as if it was what? A vacant lot for a gas station, a Sheetz, because that's its highest and best use. Yes, ma'am.
What if that was a historic place?
What if it was a historic place?
Then it's doing its highest and best.
So what you're saying, if there's some restriction that would prevent the development of that one particular lot, then it might be its highest and best use. My question for you would be, how did that one lot get this designation? Because clearly everything else around it has been redeveloped, right? Generally speaking, restrictions on historic preservation don't work that way. They cover blanketed areas, not one. Nobody's picking, because you would be pissed, honestly, if you own that one lot and they just declared, oh, well, your lot is the only one that's historic preservation, so you can't tear down your little crappy 1950 house, but everybody else can. You'd lose your mind.
But can't they say they want to have it deemed historic, and that way
Who is they?
the owner?
The owner? Can they short themselves money? Yes, absolutely they can. They don't need to have it deemed historic. They can just not develop it if that's what they want to do with it. But that has nothing to do with its highest and best use. See, this is the thing you have to come to grasp with about real estate. You ready for it? It's an industry built on greed. It's all about the money. When we talk about things like highest and best use, we're not talking about a higher calling. We're not talking about being good for humanity. We're not talking about doing favor for our fellow man. We're talking about what?
Money.
Money. Highest and best use is a monetary consideration. It's always about the money. And I'm not saying that to demean those ideas at all. I'm just saying I want to get yourself in the right frame of mind. So when we talk about something like highest and best use, I'm coming. I don't want you to wear your arm out over there. When we talk about something like highest and best use, we're talking from a monetary perspective, what that owner could do right now, right in this one moment, that would give them the greatest return on that investment. And could that change over time? Could the highest and best use of a property change from one time period to another? Like, for example, look at Briar Creek. What was the highest and best use of that land in Briar Creek 30 years ago?
Probably farm.
Cornfield, right? Because that's all that was there. Yeah, you could have built a Best Buy out there, but who would have come? But what's the highest and best use of that property now? Retail, commercial, residential, anything other than. Could someone still plant corn if they wanted to on their land out there? Of course. You would look at them and say, are you dumber than a bag of hammers? Because you're wasting your investment. Yes, ma'am. Tammy.
So technically speaking, in terms of value, if you had the lot that you were using as an example, and it was like a really nice house, you're saying that you wouldn't price it, if you're trying to sell it, you wouldn't necessarily price it off the house, but more so based off of like the land and the location.
Correct. So that Cameron's question is, just in case you didn't hear it, she said, so if we had that example of the lot in Cary, that corner lot, even if it was a really nice house, if I was trying to come up with an estimate of value for that property, I wouldn't necessarily look at valuing it as a house. I would simply value it at its potential for commercial development. And the answer is yes, because that would probably be a much higher number even than value. Even if it's a super nice house, it's always going to be probably more valuable if it were converted to that commercial use, because that kind of use just brings a much greater return on investment. Okay? Yes, ma'am.
There's actually a house in Rosewater Street. Well, it used to be a house, but they made it into a restaurant. It's called the Second Empire.
The Second Empire, yeah. It's a super nice restaurant.
Yeah.
Are you taking us there for lunch?
I went there once.
Yeah, it's very nice.
Yeah.
It is very nice, absolutely. So
I guess they got the highest and best.
that's right. The highest and best use was something other than its original use.
Yeah.
Brandon?
So if you have like a business and the area that it's in is kind of going downhill, and you had the opportunity to get it rezoned for residential, would
that could represent a better return to highest and best use. If now the land is more valuable as a residential property than it is as commercial property because the commercial uses have declined in that area, yeah, absolutely. So highest and best use can change in that direction as well. It's always going to be what brings the best return on my investment right now. Okay? Everybody good? Good. Good. All right. Investing in real estate. We're going to talk a lot about investment. In fact, there's a whole chapter about the math of investment. Investment is not something you're expected to be an expert on, but you are expected to understand the basics of investment. There are huge advantages to investing in real estate. The biggest advantage is that real property over a long enough time period never loses value in this country. We can say that with certainty because it never has. Now, if you look over a short time period, could you find time periods where real property has lost value? Like if you bought a piece of property in 2005 and you had to sell it in 2008 or 2009, could you have lost value in that real property? Yes. That's not what we mean when we say real property doesn't lose value, because that's a short-term investment. What we mean is if you bought that property in 1900 and you sold it in 2008, would you lose money or would it still be a fantastically good investment? It would be a fantastically good investment, because the reason real property has never once lost value in this country is simple. What is our population continuing to do? Grow. There are always more people who occupy the same amount of land. So what does that inevitably do to the value of land? It makes it more valuable because you have more people competing for the same land space. Does that make sense to everybody? And so that's the huge advantage of investment in real estate. It's what we call a permanence of investment, that over time there is nothing as permanent as investing in real estate. The biggest disadvantage of investing in real estate is it's not liquid. It's not a liquid investment. Liquid means cash or quickly converted to cash. Obviously, cash is a liquid investment. If you've just got money deposited in the bank or buried in a coffee can in the backyard, put in your mattress, that's a liquid investment because you can convert that right away and use it. Stocks are also considered a liquid investment. If you woke up this morning and you had $100,000 worth of stock in Microsoft, could you have the $100,000 in your account by this afternoon if you wanted to? Sure, you might have some tax implications and all those things, but you could sell it today and get the money. Could you wake up this morning and go, you know, I hate this house, I want my money? No. It would take a while. Transferring real property is a slow process. And that's the biggest disadvantage in investing in real estate, is that you can't always access the cash on demand. That's the biggest limitation about investment in real estate. That's about all we're going to talk about investment, at least at this point. There are lots of other areas that you can go into with a real estate license. You don't have to just sell. That's all I need to say about that. And then we talk about the different categories of real estate. What are the different uses of real property? Well, we're all familiar with residential use. We've seen that. We're also familiar with commercial use. You might not be as familiar with things like industrial uses or agricultural uses or special purpose uses. What I'm going to do for you here is I'm actually going to simplify this list. I'm going to simplify it down from 5 to 3. Because the truth is, there's really only 3 different types of uses here. These 3 in the middle, commercial, industrial, agricultural, we're going to mush them together. Why do I own commercial property? What's the purpose of me owning commercial property? To make money. Why do I own industrial property? To make money. Why do I own agricultural property? To make money. So realistically, aren't they all the same thing? They're all money-making properties, and that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to simplify these down to 3 things. We're going to talk about residential property. And residential property, I'm not looking at it saying it's residential, because we could have houses both be residential property and income-producing property. It's residential if the owner what? Lives there. If they bought it because they want to live in it. Could I also own a house and have it be an income-producing property? Yes. Sure. And that's what we're going to call it then. We're not going to call it residential property any longer. We're going to call it what? Income-producing property. That's our second category. Our second category of real estate is anything that the owner purchased because their primary goal is to do what? Make money. So whoever owns this building, Greg Hobbs owns this building. Why does he own this building? It's not because he wants to own office space. It's not because he likes dealing with tenants. He owns this building because he wants to produce what? Money. He wants to produce income. This is an income-generating endeavor for him. So the second category that we have, sorry, I didn't do that, is income-producing property. Anything that the owner purchased because they want to make money off of it. And then finally, special use properties. Special use properties are ones that don't fit into either of the first 2 categories. So we don't what? We don't make money on them, and we don't live there. Give me some examples of those kinds of properties. Church. Library, school. You have one?
Oh, I said school.
You said school as well? Okay. So firehouse, fire department, library, church, school, university building. All of those places would fall under special use because we don't own them to make money and we don't own them to live in. Does that make sense for everybody? And that's why we call them special use properties, because they have a very specialized use in our society. The vast majority of real estate falls into one of the first 2 categories. The vast majority of real estate is either residential or what? Or income producing. So we need to get out of the habit of saying commercial. It's either residential or income property. Residential or income. Yeah, commercial falls under income, but so does other things. Yes, sir, Brandon.
Would a shelter be a special?
Like a homeless shelter, for example, that would be a special use property because it doesn't fit. We don't own it to make money on. I don't think there are any for-profit shelters that I'm aware of. And we don't own it. We don't own it to live there. Yes, people might live there, but that's not the purpose that the owner has for it. It's that the owner lives there. Its purpose is to serve some other goal. So it's special use. Sure. Yes, ma'am.
On the test, when they ask you questions about special uses, what if they say it's like a charter school or a private school? Is that considered income producing because you have to pay to attend?
Well, so that's a really good question. Amanda's question is, you know, if it's a charter school or if it's a private school, do we consider that income producing? No, most likely not, because those are still going to be nonprofit entities. Yes, you have to pay to attend them, but realistically, there's a payment to attend any school. It just depends on where the funding comes from. But the goal is not to make money, or at least it's not supposed to be, and so it's still considered a special use property. Okay? I had somebody ask that about churches one time. I'm like, I'm not going there. I'm not going there. Not even going to open that can of worms. Okay? As far as the real estate market, supply and demand just have an offsetting relationship with one another. When supply goes up, what does demand do? They do the opposite. So when supply goes up, what does demand do? It goes down. When demand goes up sharply, what happens to supply? It goes down. It goes down dramatically. Think about the market right here in the triangle right now. What does demand look like in the residential marketplace in the triangle right now? It's insane. It's incredible. What about supply? What has that led to on the supply side? There is no supply. It's not there. And that's one of the reasons that we're seeing such crazy run-ups in prices, because right now the supply-demand dynamic is so out of balance in the triangle. In a healthy market, see, people hear that, they say, oh, you have such a healthy real estate market. You know that's not really a healthy thing, right, folks? In a healthy market, supply and demand are relatively what? Balanced. You have a relatively balanced level of supply and demand. Right now, we're tilted all one way. The problem with being tilted all one way is that inevitably you overreact. And we create too much supply, and then what does that do? And when you flip that seesaw back the other direction, what happens to all those pricing increases that you had when you were flipped this way? They evaporate, right? Because they were based on the fact that you had more demand than you had supply. Well, when it flips the other direction, they go away. And that's why I'm saying to you, don't necessarily think of it as a good thing when you see prices are just ramping up all of a sudden, because the thing that creates that dynamic could easily change at some point in time if we all of a sudden have a brand new supply of housing. What if all of a sudden Wake County just came in and permitted developers to build high-rise condominiums everywhere in Wake County? Would that change the supply dynamic? Sure it would. What would it do to pricing? It would lower it tremendously, because it would raise the available inventory, which would decrease the demand. Does that make sense for everybody? So this is a very delicate balancing act. Now, you don't need to memorize any of these things, but these are just examples of things that could have an effect on supply or demand. Like, for example, population. Does population affect demand? Yeah, because as your population grows, what does your demand do? It goes up. It goes up. And if you can't create more supply as your demand goes up, what happens to your supply? It gets lower and lower and lower. And that's what we've seen right now in the triangle, with very low supply and very high demand. And if you have to own something, that's a good thing. If you don't, it's a terrible thing. How many of you have tried to purchase something in the triangle in the last 2 years? Any of you tried to purchase a home? Fun, ain't it? It's like blood sport out there. Where'd you try to buy it? Were you successful?
Yes, but I had to pay
More than list price?
Yeah.
How many property, where was it? Where's the property?
It's in the Northeast Raleigh.
In Northeast Raleigh. How many did you offer on before you got this one? Was this the first one you offered on? Or?
Yes.
Well, that's good.
Yes.
That's good. How much above list price was it?
About five.
$5,000 above list price? How many days had it been on the market?
Oh, first day.
First day. Yeah. Did you have a lot of time to think about it, you know, and sleep on it and all that sort of thing? Or did your agent drag you over there and say, now, decide now, right now, you have to know now? Yeah. It's fun making a lifetime commitment like that, isn't it? You know? And then how do you feel about these poor people who have made offers on 8 different houses before they can finally get one? And that is a very real dynamic right now. And that's something you have to accept, that as a real estate broker will make your life a living hell, folks. It's not fun. It's not fun representing a buyer who's had to make an offer on 8 different properties. Because how many times do you get paid, by the way?
Once.
Once, if they actually close. But on all those other ones, you had to do just as much work, and you're not getting paid anything for it. They're getting frustrated, you're getting frustrated, you're running around having to show them this stuff as soon as it pops on the market. They're looking to you for advice. You don't even know what advice to give because you're already above list price. You've offered the first growing child at this point and still not getting your offer accepted. When this supply-demand dynamic gets out of balance, it can create some crazy things in the marketplace, and we're seeing that. We're certainly seeing that right now. And that's it for Chapter 1. That's it. I told you it would be a very quick overview. Trust me, Chapter 2 will not be as nearly as quick. All right, so we're going to dive right into Chapter 2. Go ahead and flip over to Chapter 2. And this is where we really start to get into the meat of the information and where progress will slow down. In fact, we will probably be in Chapter 2 all of the rest of today. We probably won't make it out of Chapter 2 for today because these topics get much more involved as we get into Chapter 2. So when we talk about Chapter 2, Chapter 2 is all about the concept of ownership, of owning property. My batteries must be getting low or something. When you talk about ownership, ownership is not one thing. It's actually a bundle of things. It's a bundle of things that have been tied together, a bundle of rights that have been tied together. There's 5 of them. And they all have a little bit of a different meaning. Like, for example, the right of possession. Let's talk about the right of possession for just a second. And it's on, you've got it on the next slide, so you don't have to write it down, but I just want to talk to you about it. The right of possession is the right to be in a property. See, we are possessing this property right now. And here's what's interesting about that. I don't own this property. You don't own this property. But yet, here we are possessing this property. How do you think that's possible? If the right of possession belongs to the owner, and it does, how is it possible that we could legally be in possession of this property? Because possession just means the legal right to occupy this property. How is it that I have the legal right to possess this property and conduct classes here even though I don't own this property? We have a lease. Is that what you were going to say, Mary? We have a lease. I have a lease. So what that lease actually did was to take that right of possession away from the owner and give it to who? The lessee, which would be me in this case. I, as the lessee, now have the right of possession. So, show you something here. I'm going to use Bryson as a guinea pig here. Here's our bundle of legal rights. There's 5 of them, right? Right of control, right of possession, right of disposition, exclusion, enjoyment. Okay? We're going to talk about a little bit about each one, what they mean. We talked about the right of possession. What did we say the right of possession was? The right to what? To be here, to occupy the property. The right of disposition, disposing of the property, that's just the right to sell the property, for example. The right of exclusion. Well, the right of exclusion is the exact opposite of the right of possession. What do you think the right of exclusion is? To keep people out. To keep people you don't want in the property out. So when Bryson purchases a property, he purchases that whole bundle of rights. All 5 of those rights are bundled up into one thing. Is everybody with me on that? So now Bryson is the owner of the property. He owns that entire legal bundle of rights. Not just one piece, but all of it. But he decides that he's going to lease the property out to Aaliyah. Now, the moment they sign that lease, he is transferring, not the whole bundle, he can sell the whole thing to her, the right of possession and the right of exclusion over to Aaliyah. She's the tenant. She has the right to occupy the property, and she has the right to tell other people that what?
They're not allowed.
That they're not allowed in the property. Isn't that pretty fair to say about a tenant? So now, that bundle has actually been what? It's been unbundled. It's been untied. It's been broken up. Are you with me so far? Now, who still owns the property? Bryson does. But look at his bundle of rights. He has less. So now he puts the property up for sale. He sells it to Kevin. So he's the grantor. Kevin is the what? Grantee. He sells the property to Kevin, so he sells him the bundle of rights. But notice the bundle is short, right? Who still has the right of possession and the right of exclusion? Aaliyah does. So let's apply that to a real world thing. See, we're up in the clouds. Now let's break it down to the real world. I'm going to ask you a very real world question based on what you just saw visually. When you sell a property in North Carolina that's occupied by a tenant, does the new owner have to honor that lease?
Yes.
What's the answer? Yes, they absolutely do. Because Bryson can't sell what he doesn't have. And what two rights did he not have? He didn't have the right of exclusion or possession. So when he sold the property, he only sold 3 of the 5 rights over to Kevin. Does that make sense? Now, eventually, are the rights going to be reunited? Is the right of possession and the right of exclusion going to come back? Yeah, when the lease does what? When the lease expires. But until that lease expires, Kevin is stuck with Aaliyah. Whether he wants to be or not doesn't make any difference. Because he has to understand that she purchased those rights for that amount of time. Is everybody with me on that? That's the whole purpose of the lease. Now I'm going to ask you another very real world question. We said the right of possession is the right to occupy the property, right? Kevin owns this property now. He wants to go in and check on it. It's his property. He has the keys. He can go over there and open the door and go check on the property, right? No, he can't. He can't. Because the right of possession is the right to do what? Be in the property. Who has the right of possession? Aaliyah does. The tenant does. Does that make sense for everybody? So now, real world question. Can a landlord enter their leased property anytime they like to?
No.
No.
Anyway.
They better not. There's a fancy legal term for that. It's called breaking and entering. It's exactly what it's called. You don't have the legal right to be there. Now, if Bryson had been smart when he signed that lease, would he have inserted something in the lease getting Aaliyah's permission to enter the property for things like property inspections? Yeah, but if he didn't do that, is there any right to enter that property? Not one. So, real world question. Tenant in North Carolina has a verbal lease. They don't have anything in writing. Landlord insists on doing a property inspection to inspect the condition of the property and enters the home while the tenant is at work after posting 24 hours notice on the door. Is this a legal activity in North Carolina? What's the answer?
No.
No. Because if they have a verbal lease, they don't have anything in writing saying that the tenant ever gave their permission for the landlord to do what? To enter the property. See how this actually matters? These bundles of rights actually matter in a very real world thing. So now what's going to happen when Aaliyah's lease expires? Her lease expires, she moves out of the property. What happens with the right of possession and the right of exclusion? It gets reunited back to Kevin, and now can he enter the property? Absolutely. And he can decide at that point in time if he wants to move in himself and occupy the property, or if he wants to turn around and do what with it again? Lease it out to somebody else. Is that clicking a little bit for you? Yes, sir.
So the right of enjoyment belongs to the tenant or to the owner?
So the right of enjoyment is actually to the owner. So the right of enjoyment is not what you think it is. It sounds like, ooh, we can have a good time, right? The right of enjoyment in a legal sense is actually the right not to have your ownership challenged. It's called the right of quiet enjoyment. In other words, you don't have to deal with somebody showing up and going, that property belongs to me. That's the owner's right.
Okay.
Yeah, so it really, enjoyment's a bad way to determine it. So that's
kind of like it belongs to the tenant.
Yeah, right. It would not. It would just be possession and exclusion.
All right.
Okay. Yes, ma'am, Mary.
Who was the original owner? I missed
Bryson
that one.
was the original owner, right here on the front.
Okay. Well, why does he own it? Did he sell it to him? Or?
He sold it to Kevin.
Okay.
He sold the
and
property to
what
Kevin.
did, I'm sorry, I forgot her name.
Aaliyah.
Aaliyah, what?
She was a tenant. She was renting.
So here, this was the setup. Bryson owned the property. Bryson purchased the property, so he had the whole legal bundle of rights. And then he leased the property to Aaliyah.
Okay.
And that gave, so what that gave her was the rights of possession and exclusion, right? And then Bryson decided, after he leased the property, decided he wanted to sell the property to Kevin. So he sells the property to Kevin, but that doesn't terminate the lease. The lease continues to go on. You with me now? Okay. Everybody good on that? Okay, go ahead, Mike.
Going back to the verbal lease, isn't that just one person for the owners?
So
whenever it comes to the entering,
Bryson's question is, in the case of an oral lease, isn't it the word of the owner against the tenant? No, because what the state of North Carolina does is in the absence of a written lease, the state creates one for you. And the state's not going to give you the right to access the property like that. So if you want the right to access the property, you need to have a written lease that specifies that. Yep.
What if it's an emergency situation?
Emergencies are different. If there's an emergency, like a life-threatening thing or something that threatens the property, generally speaking, the law carves out the ability to enter the property for that kind of a purpose. But what I would tell you is, even in the case of an emergency, if it's an emergency, what number should you be dialing? 911. Don't try to make a case that you entered that property for emergency purposes if you haven't first dialed 911 and waited for them to show up to go in the property with you. We've had that happen. People say, well, I only went in there because it was an emergency. And you know what the first question the magistrate's going to ask is? Where's the record of the 911 call? Where did you call the authorities? If it was an emergency, clearly you should have been in contact with the authorities. Well, I feared for the tenant's safety. So what are you going in there, Dirty Harry? You should have called the police. So you see what I mean about that? So if you're claiming that it's an emergency, you should be accompanied by some type of a law enforcement officer. Yes, ma'am.
If the contract is violated by the tenant, does that give the landlord permission to go into the building?
Great question. If the contract is violated by the tenant, does that give the landlord permission to go into the building? Here's the better question. Who's to say the tenant has violated the contract?
As in, not making payments or stipulations that were on the property?
And again, I'm going to ask the same question. Who's to say they have violated the contract? Because there's only one say that matters in such a question. Where is that say? Court of law. See, the landlord doesn't get to decide if the tenant's violated the contract. Who has to make that decision?
Judge.
A court of law. So the follow-up, the answer to your question is, there's no way for that landlord to unilaterally, which just means by themselves, say, you violated the lease, I'm going in. They'd have to first go where? To court, and get a court to agree that that tenant had violated the lease. That's what contracts are for. See, that's when we get to contract law, one of the things I'm going to stress over and over and over is that contracts aren't for us. We are mere mortal people. Contracts are for judges and magistrates and courts of law, because they ultimately have the say-so on those documents. We can't decide. I can look at it and say, yes, I believe the tenant is in breach, but I have to get a court of law to agree with me before I can take action, because all I've done by entering the property is made it so that we've both breached the agreement. They have, and then I have. And as the old expression goes, two wrongs don't make a right. And that's really frustrating when you start renting a property out. You're renting a property, they aren't paying the rent. And you feel like you need to go in and check on the property. And you feel like, well, they ain't even paying the rent. I'm going in here. You still go to jail for that. So be careful. Okay? Probably more of an answer you wanted, but did I see anybody else's hand? Are we good? Do we understand this idea of a bundle of rights? And that they can be unbundled. Okay? Good. Good. We talked about what each one was. The right of disposition, I can sell it. The right of exclusion, I can tell others to get out. And the right of possession, I have the right to be here or occupy. Those are the ones I would think you might see the most of. Disposition, possession, exclusion. So if you wanted to highlight ones that you just need to be familiar with. Again, sort of a level one thing, just definitional. And then again, back to our big word of the day, the appurtenance. What did we say an appurtenance was? It's permanent. It's attached. It can be a physical attachment. It can also be a thing that we can't see that's attached. So restrictions like zoning restrictions or covenants. How many of you have covenants? You own your house and you have covenants on those properties. Those covenants are appurtenances, which means they're attached for how long?
Forever.
Forever. And This is my favorite expression in the world. You'll hear me use it probably 1,000 times throughout the class. The fleas come with the dog. That is an old Southern expression for those of you who are not from the South, which means you don't get to pick and choose which things you buy. If you're buying the dog, you're also buying the what? The fleas. So, for example, I would love to think I could go out and buy a property without the covenants, but I can't because the covenants are appurtenant, which means they are permanently what? Attached to the property. So when you hear people complain about this idea, who gave them the right to tell me I couldn't put up a fence in my backyard because they're bitching because they're looking at their covenants and the HOA has told them that they can't put a fence up in their backyard. And that's inevitably what they say. Who gives them the right to tell me I can't put a fence up? What's the answer to that question is? You gave them the right. Because that rule was there when you did what? When you bought the property. And if you didn't know that was the rule when you bought the property, then it's your own fault. Because that rule was appurtenant, it was there long before you, and it's going to be there long after you. Because that rule is permanently attached to that property. Does that make sense for everybody? That's what we mean by an appurtenance. You can't shake it. You can't get rid of it, even if you want to. There are some things that are appurtenances which are great. This building is an appurtenance to this property. Well, obviously, if I'm buying land, I would want to buy this appurtenance. But there are going to be other things like the restrictions about what I can do with this property, which I don't want. Doesn't matter. They're all attached. They're all appurtenant to the property. So we're going to hear that word over and over and over. And most of the time, these do last forever, meaning that if the property's sold, what's going to happen to the appurtenances? They can transfer with the property, and the new owner is going to have to take responsibility for them. So just to give you an idea, I'm going to put a little worm in your brain about that. We're going to talk about liens later on today or tomorrow. Probably tomorrow we'll get into liens. A lien. A lien means you owe somebody money. And they placed a lien on your property as collateral. So that if you don't pay them, they can do what? What does collateral mean? If you don't pay them, they can do what? They can repossess, or what we call it foreclose, right? They can foreclose on the property so that they can get their money back. That's what a lien is. It's the right to foreclose on your property so that they can guarantee getting their money back. What's the most common example that you can think of off the top of your head of a lien that would be attached to a piece of real property? A mortgage loan? That's a good example. Property taxes? Property tax lien? Because if I don't pay my mortgage note, what are they going to do? What's the lender going to do? Foreclose. Which means they're going to take ownership of the property and sell it to get their money back. Does that make sense for everybody? Liens are appurtenances, which means they last how long? Forever. And which means they transfer with the property. So Aaliyah's buying a house. The current owner has a mortgage loan. Aaliyah buys the property and the current owner decides not to pay off the mortgage loan. What's the status of the lien? Still where? Attached to the property, which now belongs to who? Aaliyah. So if that person stops paying on that note, whose property is it that it's going to be foreclosed on? Aaliyah's property. Because that's what the lien is attached to. That ain't fair. That ain't right. But it is, because it's Aaliyah's fault that that happened. If Aaliyah had been doing her job as a buyer, what would she have made sure happened before she took ownership of the property? Pay that lien what? Off. Clear that lien. I'm not taking ownership of this thing while that lien's attached, because once I take ownership, it's too late. The lien comes with it because it's what? Because it's appurtenant. Does that make sense for everybody? It stays with the property. These are really important to understand, folks. Yes, ma'am.
Isn't that the closing attorney's thing to make sure things paid off?
Well, it is the closing attorney's thing, but ultimately that's the buyer's responsibility. Who does the closing attorney work for? The buyer. Why do we hire a closing attorney? Because we're not smart enough to do that on our own, so we hire them to represent our best interest, right? So it's the buyer hiring the closing attorney to take care of things like that for them. That's exactly right. But if Aaliyah were to, I mean, you know, people do silly things. Let's just say Aaliyah's paying cash for the property. She don't want to pay a closing attorney $1,000. Well, I'm going to pay them $1,000. This is a simple thing. I don't need a closing attorney. So she buys that property from Bo. She gives him $200,000 cash. And Bo signs a deed over to her. And Bo's got a mortgage for $180,000. He takes her $200,000 and he moves to Columbia. Well, what happens to the lien?
She gets stuck with 180.
Hey, it's still attached to the property, right? Now, she doesn't owe the money. We can't ever, it's not like she owes the money to the bank, but that's really kind of a difference, a distinction without a difference, because ultimately, if the loan doesn't get paid, whose property is going to get taken? Aaliyah's property. So, what should she have done before she handed Bo that $200,000? Made sure that lien was satisfied, that lien was paid off, because she needs to be aware that that lien is going to transfer with the property because it is appurtenant. So we should have been better off to pay the closing attorney $1,000 to make sure those things get satisfied. Yep. Is that starting to click a little bit about this idea of an appurtenance? It's always going to transfer with the property, so you have to make sure to protect against those things. These are things that it's going to be absolutely your responsibility to make your client aware of, whether they're your client or your customer, whether you represent them or not, to make them aware of all the appurtenances before they buy the property, because it's too late once they buy the property. These things are attached to the property. Once ownership's transferred, the appurtenances have also transferred. So it's very important to make people aware of what they're getting before they get it. So one of the first categories of appurtenances we talk about are what we call subsurface rights. Subsurface rights are just the rights to anything below the ground. Remember, we said you own everything not only above, but everything what? Below. So subsurface rights are appurtenances. The status of the subsurface rights are appurtenances. We shouldn't really say the rights are appurtenant. What we should say is the status of the rights. So we'll go back to Kevin. When Kevin bought that property, did he also purchase the subsurface rights? Yes, he did, because the status of the subsurface rights is that they're with the property. Well, guess what? Kevin could sell, not the property, but just the rights. What if Annie owns a gas exploration company, and she wants to buy the rights to any gas that might be found below the surface of Kevin's property? Can Kevin sell Annie's company just the gas exploration rights? He can. How long is he selling those rights for? What period of time? Forever. Because that becomes an appurtenance on the property. That becomes a permanent status of the property, that the oil and gas rights have been stripped away from the property. So from now on in the future, when Kevin sells that property over to Francisco, for example, he needs to make Francisco aware of the fact that you're buying the property. What are you not buying? The oil and gas rights. So Francisco may come home one day and find that gas has been found on the property, and here's Annie out there exporting that gas up and selling it off and getting rich, because those oil and gas rights belong to her company. Does that make sense for everyone? Okay. So these subsurface rights are appurtenance in of themselves. Yes, ma'am. Did you have a question?
Okay, so you're saying he can sell the subsurface rights.
Mm-hmm.
But he doesn't have to sell the land.
Correct.
Okay. Okay.
Alright.
Yes, sir. ma'am.
Alright, so if you're selling the subsurface rights, wouldn't that, you wouldn't have a contract for that? Like, it wouldn't be under a certain amount of time, they just have indefinite rights, whatever's under it?
If you're certainly, if you did it for a certain amount of time, you would be leasing the subsurface rights. Whereas if you were selling them, that would be permanently.
Okay, so there's
Two different things. You could lease the subsurface rights. You could also sell them. A lease would be for a certain amount of time. Sale would be permanent. And so that would not impede or prevent Kevin from selling the property, but he's just got to make future buyers aware of the fact that they're purchasing the property, but not the what? The subsurface or oil or gas rights. And so this is not so common here in North Carolina. It's possible in North Carolina, but it's very common in states like Texas, for example. Why do you think this would be very common in a state like Texas, to strip away the oil and gas exploration rights and sell them separately? Why? There's a lot of what?
Oil.
There's a lot of oil there. And so it's very common, if you go buy a property in Texas, you are not buying the oil and gas rights. Matter of fact, we had a builder here in North Carolina that tried to make it very common, real slick like, didn't tell anybody. How many of you ever heard of D.R. Horton? D.R. Horton? D.R. Horton is a Texas-based company. Because they're based in Texas, it's their standard operating procedure that when they sold a home, they did not sell or convey the oil and gas rights. They keep the oil and gas rights, so if there's ever any finding of oil or gas on that property, they could sell the oil and gas rights to all the lots in the whole neighborhood to a gas exploration company. Are you following me on that? And that's standard in Texas. Everybody understands that's what happens in Texas. Nobody understands that in North Carolina. Because in North Carolina, there wasn't anything worth having under the ground until the state legislature several years ago approved something called fracking. How many of y'all have ever heard of something called fracking? Fracking is a method of gas exploration where they pump high pressure water into the ground and shatter the underground substructure, causing it to release natural gas. It's a natural gas exploration method. Basically, they put so much pressure on the ground that the underground structure shatters, that releases the natural gas, it bubbles up, and they capture it. Well, now that there's valuable gas that can be extracted legally, is there some incentive to probably sell the gas rights to somebody? So D.R. Horton started, whenever they sold a home in North Carolina, not conveying the oil and gas rights. And this went on for about 5 years. And then finally somebody caught on and said, wait a minute. And D.R. Horton said, well, that's not illegal. And the state of North Carolina said, you're right, it's not. But we can fix that. And so the state legislature passed a law that says you now have to disclose when you're not conveying the oil and gas rights. We created a form for it, and you now have to sign saying whether or not you've stripped away the oil and gas rights. And D.R. Horton got so much bad press and got attacked by the North Carolina Attorney General, they finally came back retroactively and gave back those oil and gas rights to all those property owners. So they did eventually get the oil and gas rights back to those properties. Yes, ma'am?
So is that the same with the water rights?
Water rights would also be a subsurface right. That's exactly right. So the reason you can put a well in and pump water from the ground is because you own the rights to everything below the surface. But if you've sold off all the subsurface rights, that would include water as well. That happens a lot in states that have a lot of agricultural uses, where you may sell off your water rights. Like you say, if you have good access to an underground aquifer in your property, you might sell the underground water access rights to somebody who needs it to irrigate farmland or something like that. Yes, sir?
How the buyer or the broker can know that the surface rights have been sold or not?
It is almost impossible. It is nearly impossible. Francisco's question is, how can the buyer or broker know? The truth is, we largely rely on the seller telling the truth about those kinds of things. We rely on the closing attorney doing a title search to make sure there's no documentation of the subsurface rights having been sold. And then ultimately rely on title insurance. We buy title insurance that would cover in case we were to buy the property and not get the oil and gas rights. But it is very hard to know for sure. Very hard. Yes, sir?
So if you sold the subsurface rights, but like you lived on the surface, how would they be able to go through your property to obtain it?
That's a really good question, and it brings up a good point. Just because they have the rights to access the things below ground doesn't necessarily mean they have the right to like put an oil rig on your yard, right? That would be a different type of lease. But they could access it from an adjacent property, for example. So say if they leased the property next door to put the oil rig and you sold them the subsurface rights, well, they could tunnel down and over And so they could be, you know, for example, especially with fracking, you might be sitting in your property and all of a sudden feel a vibration. Well, that's when they're injecting that pressurized, you know, solution there. So, everybody okay on the idea of a subsurface right? They are appurtenances, so their status is an appurtenance, and that includes water as well, because that's a subsurface resource. Air rights are also appurtenance, so you can lease the air rights or sell the air rights, for example, for use of things like cell phone towers would be an example of that. Now, water rights are something you could expect probably to see on a test. Now, why did it do that? Back to this. When we talk about water rights, we're talking about rights of property owners whose properties border on water. We're not talking about the rights of property owners who have water on their property. If you have a pond on your property, or if you have a stream that runs through your property and your property is on both sides of the stream, this does not affect you. We're talking about property owners whose property border, their boundary, their property line is water. And that's a pretty common thing. It's very common if you have a creek or a stream for the creek or stream to be the property line. Especially those of you that are from more rural parts of the state will recognize that. It's very common for that to happen. Also, if you own property on a lake, if you own property on a pond, where's your property line most likely going to be? Where the water is. And so what we're talking about here is where the water is the boundary. Okay, where our property is bounded by water on at least one side. There are certain rights that go along with that. We need to know, what are our rights to access in the water? Does the water belong to us or does it belong to the public? We need to know where our property line begins and ends. That's what we're talking about in this section. So we have two different kinds, or two different bodies of water. We have riparian bodies of water and littoral bodies of water. I have really never been able to come up with a cutesy way to remember these words. I've tried, I've twisted it around in my brain, it just doesn't work. Riparian is this body of water, a fresh body of water, something that doesn't have a tide. So any body of water that doesn't have a tide. Give me examples of that. Yes, ma'am, Jane.
I was thinking maybe riparian with an R, like rivers.
So that if you wanted to remember riparian with an R would be river, okay.
Has an O, so ocean.
Littoral, ocean, okay. That way, whatever works for you would be great. So what other examples, what examples of riparian bodies of water? Things that don't have a tide. Rivers, what else? Lakes, streams, creeks, ponds, any body of water that doesn't have a tide. This is a littoral body of water. Littoral bodies of water do have a tide. So in North Carolina, what bodies of water are we talking about?
Beaches, oceans.
The Atlantic Ocean, the Pamlico Sound, the Albemarle Sound, those would be examples of littoral bodies of water in North Carolina. You need to know which you're talking about because the rights are going to be a little bit different based on the kind of waterway you're talking about. Everybody good with that? So what's the differentiator here? Whether or not it has a what? A tide. If it has a tide, it's a littoral body of water. If it doesn't have a tide, it's a riparian body of water. Well, riparian bodies of water come in lots of shapes and sizes. So we kind of need to break them down a little bit further. Remember we said riparian are ones that do or don't have a tide. Which one? Riparian.
Don't.
No tide, okay? So they come in lots of shapes and sizes. Rivers, creeks, streams. Well, we break those down into ones that are navigable versus ones that are non-navigable. A riparian body of water that's non-navigable would be something like a creek. A pond would probably be non-navigable because there's no way to navigate that body of water with a motorboat. So that's the definition. It says you can navigate the body of water with a motorboat, then it's navigable. If you can't, then it's non-navigable. Is everybody good with me on that definition? So for example, this picture on the right, is that a navigable or non-navigable body of water?
Navigable.
It's navigable. It's still riparian because it doesn't have a tide, but it's a navigable body of water. And that makes a big difference because navigable water always belongs to the public. A navigable piece of water or a navigable waterway is a public waterway. That means the ownership of the water belongs to who? The public. That means who can access that water? Everybody. It belongs to the public. It can be accessed by the public. It's not restricted to just some limited group of people. It's everybody's to use as they see fit. Does that make sense for everybody? Whereas with a non-navigable body of water, it's not going to be a public waterway. If it can't be navigated, there's no need for it to be public. And that changes things. So here's two pictures. Turn the lights off for a second so you can see them a little better. There's two pictures of both riparian bodies of water in North Carolina. The one on the left is a non-navigable body of water, whereas the one on the right is navigable. Now they're both riparian. Neither one has a what? Neither one has a tide. Would you agree that it would be hard to navigate this one with a motorboat? I mean, it's like 3 inches deep, right? Look at these little tiny rocks sticking up here. You're not going to navigate that. Would you agree that this one is very much navigable? As a matter of fact, you can see they're doing it out there right now. So this waterway right here, the one on the right, who does it belong to? The public. So therefore, who can access it? Anybody. It belongs to anybody and everybody. And so if the water belongs to the public, and if I own this piece of land right over here, where do you think my property line is going to be? It's going to be where the water starts. And that's exactly what we see. But look at the other one. Because it's not navigable, the water doesn't belong to the public. It belongs to these private landowners. So if we have an owner on this side and another owner on that side, so two different owners, one on the right and one on the left, where's the property line going to be?
Center.
Right down the middle. Because that water doesn't belong to the public, it actually belongs to these two property owners because it's not navigable. Does that make sense? Whereas when this one over here, this person's property line is here, and if you own this property line would be right there, so there'd be the gap for the water because the water belongs to the public. Here, there is no gap because the water actually belongs to the private landowners. Is everybody okay with that? Now that makes a big difference. If I own this piece of property, and I come out here and I see somebody fishing in this stream, can I tell them to get out?
Yes.
Yes, because the stream belongs to who?
You.
Me. At least there's half of it. The other half belongs to somebody else. But at least if they're sitting right here, camped out on this side, and they're standing fishing, I can tell them to get out because that property belongs to me. Are you with me on that? Can I tell somebody to stop fishing right here? No, because who does that water belong to? The public. Go ahead.
As long as they're not standing on your land.
They can't be on my land, but if they're in a boat out here, or even if they're wading, as long as they're in the water, they're in the public property. Is everybody okay with that? So that brings up all kinds of interesting questions. Like, my parents live on Lake Gaston. My mom hates when I teach this section of the class. My parents live on Lake Gaston. How many of you have ever been to Lake Gaston? Seen Lake Gaston? If you go, the lake has beautiful houses around it. And almost all those beautiful waterfront houses have what sitting out in the water? A boathouse. Who do those boathouses belong to?
Everyone.
The public. Because where are they?
In the water.
In the water. They don't belong to the people who built them. They don't belong to those properties. They belong to everybody equally. That is the price you pay for putting something in a public waterway. Does that make sense for everybody? They are in the public's waterway, so therefore they belong to the public. It's just the way the law works. Now, don't go trying to attach your boat to them. You probably get shot. I'm not going to want that to happen to you. So, but that's the way the law works. But they belong to the public. Okay, are we all good on this? Everybody?
Yes.
Yep, go ahead.
So with a pier and a dock, even though that's attached to
Even though it's attached to the land, the portion that extends into the public waterway belongs to the public. That's exactly right. Because you can't restrict use in any way of this waterway. And by saying, oh, you can't tie off to my dock, aren't you restricting use of a public waterway? You can't. You sure are. Can't do it. And it belongs to the public. It's equal. It's the same as that street out there. I'm pointing to the, like through the wall. It's the same as the street, Navajo Drive. Who does that belong to?
Public.
The public. I can use it, but I don't have any more use of it than you do. And the owner of the building doesn't have any more use of it than we do, just because they own the property, because it belongs equally to everybody. It's the same way you treat that water when it's navigable. Yes, sir, Brandon.
So, just like, if you were to buy land that's on the body of water, and you made a man-made, like, river around your house, so to speak, would that be a part of that water with your land?
So, which body of water are we talking about?
The navigable.
The navigable one. And you did what? What are you doing, like making a moat around your house, or building a castle?
You just, yeah, put like a ring of water around.
Okay, so you attach into the water here and then back out over here. Do you own the property on either side of that? Is it, in other words, are you doing it all the way out on the boundary of your property, or are you doing it completely within your property?
Like you're following the property line.
Following your property line, you might have some problems. What I would suggest is doing it inside your property line. In other words, leave a 3-foot boundary on the inside, because as long as it's completely inside your property, it's private property. These rules only apply when it's on the boundary.
Okay.
So if you didn't want to bring up the issue, leave a boundary just to be safe.
Even if it is still accessible?
Even if it is still accessible, it will be private property, because it's completely within land that you own. Yes, ma'am.
Wouldn't that not be allowed because you're messing with the water? Like
It very well might not be. Yeah, you'd have to go through all kinds of approvals to, get, to make that modification. They probably wouldn't allow you to do it, most likely. But it's fun to think about. I like having a moat around my house. I mean, who wouldn't? I showed a house in Cary one time that had a moat in it. $3 million. You can get a moat in Cary. It's over in McGregor Downs. It is a castle, and yes, it has a moat with a drawbridge, no less. So, if you want one of those, if you're in the market for it, it already exists for you. It's on Lock and Bar Drive, I think. Are we good on this? Okay. So these are the riparian bodies of water. We still got to talk about the littoral bodies of water. Littoral bodies of water are easier to understand because we don't have to break them down into navigable versus non-navigable. A littoral body of water is an ocean, folks. It's always what? Navigable. So we don't have to worry about that part of it. We just got, when the water's navigable, where's the property line going to be? Let me back up to the other slide. Where was the property line on that navigable body of water? Where the water starts, right? Well, apply that here. Where does the water start? That's the whole problem with littoral bodies of water. The water starts in different places depending on the time of day, doesn't it? We wouldn't want to ask this question today, by the way, down at the coast. Where does water start? It's everywhere. So, with a littoral body of water, the property line is still going to be where the water starts. But because we have a tide and because the water moves in and out, we choose the high tide line as the property line. So this would be the property line. That high tide, that high water mark is going to be considered the property line. Now, can that change over time? If you get beach erosion, for example, if the high tide line comes up further in, then guess what moves with it? The property line moves. If the Corps of Engineers comes and pumps sand out on the beach and moves the high tide line out by 100 feet, guess what happens to your property line? It moves. Because the property line is going to be defined for these properties as wherever the high tide line is. Is everybody okay with that idea? Now, what that also means is just like this water belongs to the public, what about this exposed land when it is exposed? During the parts of the day when this land is exposed, who does it belong to?
Everyone.
The public. In North Carolina, folks, there are no such things as a private beach because of this. The only time the only private beach is behind this line. Does that make sense for everybody? But out here is public property. It's no coincidence that when you see where people are all set up, look at where they are. They're on the public portion of the beach. And you can't, even if you own one of these properties, you can't restrict the use of this out here. It's called the foreshore. You don't need to know that. But legally in North Carolina, that belongs to the public. That is not true in every state, by the way. Different states have different laws about this. New Jersey is a notable example of one that is very different. In New Jersey, when you own property on the shoreline, you own the beach in front of that property as well. And so if you ever end up working in the coastal market here in North Carolina and you have buyers that are coming from New Jersey, you need to have a very long conversation with them about the fact that they're not buying the beach. Because trust me, they think they are. We have a case right now that's pending at the North Carolina Supreme Court where a couple from New Jersey who bought land in Swansboro has challenged the way North Carolina handles beachfront property. And they're saying that that land should belong to them. And they pushed that challenge all the way to the North Carolina Supreme Court. And it may end up in the United States Supreme Court. So that's a notable difference. So that's a North Carolina thing of how we treat littoral properties. Everybody good on that? Good, good. So that's where the property line would begin and end. Watch your eyes. Okay? Other support rights that we would have, and you don't need to know these more past just definitions. Lateral support and subadjacent support. That just means you're not allowed to do anything on your property which would endanger your neighbor's property. Yeah, my property line might be right here, and then Bryce's property line is over there. But if I dig a 12-foot deep trench right here beside my property line, what's going to happen to his fence on his property? It's going to collapse in. I can't legally do that. I'm not allowed to create a disruption on my property that disturbs his property. We owe that right of support to our neighbors. Everybody okay with that? That is a good break spot for our lunch break here, okay? So you've done well, you've made it to lunch. First day, you made it to lunch, that's always an accomplishment, right? So here's what we'll do. It is, so why don't you come back at, just say 1 o'clock, okay? Come back at 1 o'clock, it's 12:25 basically right now, so it's about 35 minutes. Come back at 1, and then we'll pick right back up here, okay? Let's stop that camera.